Today we're going to be diving into one of the longevity peptides or bioregulators known as Epitalon. When people talk about anti-aging peptides, Epitalon's name always gets thrown into the mix, and we're going to dive into why that is. But before we do, I wanted to just say that I'm very pro-aging. I just use that terminology because it's common language when we talk about longevity science. Now, when we actually dig into the science behind Epitalon, we find that it's a lot more than just hype. It's actually a really interesting convergence of telomere biology, circadian rhythm, epigenetics, immune aging, and mitochondrial health. So these are several of the hallmarks of aging converging in one bioregulator peptide. So it's fascinating, and we're going to dive into all of that. Now, it's not a miracle peptide. It's not a fountain of youth. It's definitely not clinically validated, but mechanistically, Epitalon is one of the most fascinating peptides that we've really ever studied in longevity science, especially because, like I said, it doesn't just hit one pathway, it touches several of the core systems that drift as we age. Now, before we get started, I'm Dr. Christy. I have a PhD in molecular and cellular oncology, and I've spent my career working in genomics, but I also love peptides, so I love talking about them, exploring them, reading about them, and everything longevity science. And before we dive in, I should say this is intended for educational purposes only. I'm not condoning the use of any peptides discussed. We're just exploring a research framework. And I don't intend to cover every possible aspect of the science in this video, but we will get into some of the main key mechanisms. Epitalon is a very small peptide. It's just 4 amino acids: alanine, glutamine, asparagine, and glycine. It's also referred to AEDG in the literature. That's the abbreviation. And it's modeled after a natural peptide known as epithalamin. And this comes from the pineal gland. That pineal connection is going to turn out to be incredibly important as we go through this story and kind of understanding how Epitalon behaves the way it does. So let's talk about that. The pineal gland is essentially the body's timekeeper. It's a tiny pine cone shaped gland, an endocrine gland in the center of the brain, and it produces the hormone melatonin, which we all know is that's crucial for that sleep-wake cycle or circadian rhythm. And the pineal gland is also responsive to light and dark for setting that circadian rhythm. And melatonin, by the way, is way more than just a sleep hormone. It's actually an antioxidant, it's an immune modulator, it's a mitochondrial protectant, and it's a signal that helps us synchronize a lot of downstream biology. It's super, super important. And as we age, our pineal function declines, and also our melatonin output starts to drop, and actually sometimes by as much as 75%, which is pretty crazy. So this leads to circadian rhythm disruptions, cortisol rhythms that can shift and change because of that, changes to immune signaling, and even our metabolism is all tied into that. We all know that when we have a bad night of sleep, we're hungrier and crave carbs. Well, it's all tied together. And what's really interesting is that over the last decade, we've learned that telomere maintenance is tightly linked to circadian rhythm as well. There's a pivotal paper showing that telomerase activity actually oscillates with the circadian clock, so it changes depending on the clock. So telomerase expression depends on genes called clock and BMAL1. These are the core circadian transcription factors, and transcription factors, remember, are just, they sit down on the DNA and they kind of tell it to turn that gene expression on. When those are disrupted, that's when the telomeres can shorten faster. And so this one publication, they studied shift workers in the ER, either they compared daytime shift to nighttime shift. In the daytime shifts, they had a normal pattern, which was basically high telomerase, which was mTERT, and high telomerase activity at 10 a.m. and then low telomerase activity at 5 p.m. And the night shift workers, on the other hand, they just had low telomerase activity all throughout the day compared with the daytime workers. So telomere biology isn't just about aging, it's also about this timing effect, which I find really interesting. And that's kind of where Epitalon might play in. So that's why Epitalon and the circadian effects matter when we talk about telomeres. Now, in that paper, I thought it was interesting in the discussion, the authors talked about 2 points. They said, telomerase expression is essential for cancer cells, but inactive in normal cells. That's something that's well known. But the other point they made was that shift workers have an increased incidence of breast cancer, metabolic syndrome, and decreased immune function, and it's similar to a cluster of human telomere syndrome. So that was an interesting connection I thought that they made at the end there. It is well known that people who work night shifts happen to have more of these types of diseases and can develop cancer, and so maybe that's related to this telomerase or circadian biology. So I thought that was really interesting. Now let's talk about telomeres directly. So telomeres themselves are they're repetitive DNA sequences on the end of your chromosomes. Every time the cell divides, those get a little shorter, and once they get too short, the cell enters senescence. This is a permanent growth arrested state, and the cells in senescence, they don't die. They're sometimes referred to as zombie cells because they're not dead and they're not really alive, but they do secrete inflammatory signals, and that can contribute to tissue dysfunction. This is the Hayflick limit, so cells can divide around 40 to 60 times before they become senescent, and that's true for most somatic cells. Cancer cells, on the other hand, they have figured out ways to continue dividing. One of those ways is by increasing telomerase activity, which we'll talk about too. Telomerase is the enzyme that helps to rebuild telomeres, but in normal cells, this is shut off after birth. Cancer cells, on the other hand, often reactivate telomerase or use alternative lengthening pathways to continue dividing indefinitely. It's one of the hallmarks of cancer, and that's why telomerase activation kind of raises a red flag in longevity discussions, but we don't have all the answers, of course. We'll try to explain some of that in this video. Epitalon has been shown in multiple studies to actually increase telomerase activity. It extends telomere length in human cells. So there was an experiment where they have done this in human lung fibroblasts, and Epitalon allowed the cells to divide beyond the Hayflick limit. And in human lymphocytes from donors that were in either from their 20s to their 80s, Epitalon increased telomere expression by 33.3% in some cases. And mechanistically, it appeared to do this through direct interaction with DNA. And it's also been shown that there are sequences on DNA that Epitalon can directly interact with. And this could be a way that it could modulate transcriptional activity or allow gene transcription to be turned on, gene expression to be turned on. One study showed that it could activate neuronal genes. So those are your brain neurons in a stem cell model. So this could be really cool. They were trying to show that maybe Epitalon could push these stem cells to differentiate into neuronal cells, brain cells, which would be really interesting in the case of a neurodegenerative disease like Alzheimer's or Parkinson's, something along those lines. It's definitely too early to be making any claims on this, but it was a really nice intro study showing that effect, that in the presence of Epitalon, those mesenchymal stem cells were able to differentiate into they didn't show full differentiation, I should say. They showed that it was expressing markers of the neuronal cells. So very early, very interesting work, could be very fascinating for neurodegenerative disease in the future. But here's where some newer data adds another layer of nuance. So there was a recent paper that looked at Epitalon in normal human cells and breast cancer cell lines. It's actually 4 cell lines, 2 normal and 2 cancer cell lines. And what they found was really interesting. Epitalon increased telomere length in 3 out of these 4 cell lines. It increased the H-TERT expression across the board. So again, H-TERT, that's telomerase reverse transcriptase. And that gene provides instructions for making one component of the enzyme telomerase. So in this study, telomerase activity itself only increased in the normal cells and not in the cancer cells. But the cancer cells, the cancer cells were exposed to Epitalon, and those actually used an alternative pathway that I mentioned earlier called alternative lengthening of telomeres. And this is a recombination-based mechanism that can be used by cancer cells. It's something normal that normally happens in the cancer transition process, but Epitalon also activated that. So it didn't simply turn on telomerase everywhere. Its effects were very context dependent, which was interesting. Now, this doesn't automatically mean that it's safe, but it does challenge the oversimplified idea that Epitalon blindly fuels cancer growth. We know that biology is rarely binary. There's so much complexity and so much layers that we don't fully understand, especially oftentimes in the context of peptides that haven't been, validated clinically. Now, telomeres are only one part of Epitalon's story. We're going to start to build some layers. So there's another aspect where it really shines, which is going to be epigenetics. All right, so aging isn't just about acquired DNA damage, it's also about epigenetic drift. We have the same DNA sequence in all of our cells, but gene expression changes over time and during development of those cells. So this is really, I like to explain it this way. It's actually why a liver cell looks different than an eye cell, looks different from a skin cell. They all have the same genome, but through epigenetics or silencing of those genes, the the liver cell, for example, only expresses liver relevant genes and not genes for eyes and ovaries and skin. That's epigenetics. But we also have another aspect of epigenetics, which happens through lifestyle factors, and we can modify and silence or express our genes based on, exercise and food and, sunlight and different things that are in our environment. And another aspect of epigenetics is chromatin remodeling or histone remodeling. So these are proteins that the DNA is wound around, and it basically prohibits those transcription factors. Remember, those are like the little light switches that turn the genes on. They have to get into the DNA, sit on the DNA. And if the DNA is all wound around these histones, which it should be, that's a normal thing. We want it to be tightly packed and protected. But when it's time to turn it on, we want that chromatin to unwind, and then the transcription factors can get in there and access the DNA and turn on that gene expression. So another factor that can change as we age are the chromatin remodeling. The structure can become like more rigid, or we can have histone modifications, and then promoter regions become less accessible, and gene expression can kind of shift because of that or get noisier. Now, epitalon, this is where epitalon comes in. So it's been shown to enter the nucleus and bind directly to DNA and to histones. So histones, specifically H1, H2B, H3, and H4, those are the histones that it can bind with, or it's been modeled to bind to. And then promoter regions in the DNA that are rich in CAG sequences, that's the DNA sequence, or TTC sequences, that's where we've shown that epitalon can bind to those, and therefore it can loosen the chromatin structure, and it can make accessible, like make the DNA more accessible for transcription. So in other words, it's affecting the gene transcription by opening up that structure. That's at least the theory. So short peptides typically don't do this. This is very unique to epitalon and a couple of others. But this again, remember, it's a 4 amino acid peptide, and it can interact directly with DNA and histones. And this positions epitalon not as like a blunt activator, but as a very specific gene expression modulator, which is pretty cool. And that helps explain why epitalon shows these effects across a wide range of systems. So it impacts antioxidant defense, DNA repair, those circadian genes, immune signaling, and even neurogenesis. And we think it's doing this through epigenetic mechanisms. Now, on the circadian side, epitalon regulates enzymes that are involved in melatonin synthesis. No surprise there. And that includes AANAT and phosphorylated cyclic AMP response element binding protein, or PCREB. In animal models, including primates, it restores youthful melatonin rhythms and normalizes cortisol timing. Again, remember, cortisol is also linked to our sleep-wake cycles. It's actually completely opposite to melatonin. I'll put a little graph. So cortisol is meant to come up in the morning and starts to decline, and it's lowest right before we go to bed. And melatonin does the exact opposite. It's low in the morning, and goes up right before bed. So those two are regulated together. There was a human study with 75 women, and they were actually given sublingual epitalon. The dose was 0.5 milligrams per day, and they were given this for 20 days. The researchers saw a very significant change in the circadian gene expression in immune cells, and this included the clock-related genes. Clock genes are a core set of genes that includes clock, BMAL, BMAL1, PER, and CRY, and these form an internal molecular feedback loop that happens in nearly every cell, and it creates this circadian 24-hour circadian rhythm that regulates our sleep, our body temperature, hormone release, metabolism, and other biological processes. So pretty fascinating that these little tiny molecules do all of that. And these findings indicate that Epitalon's effects extend beyond simply boosting melatonin output. It acts more of a true circulating regulator that's capable of retraining the system in aging humans. Pretty fascinating again. This is important because melatonin doesn't just help you sleep, it regulates the immune tone, it suppresses excessive cell proliferation, it supports mitochondrial function, and again, it acts as a powerful antioxidant, and it's even been shown to act as a to have cancer suppression function. It actually has anti-proliferative and pro-apoptotic signaling capabilities, and it also plays a role in this hormonal feedback loop that includes cortisol and estrogen and testosterone. So all those rhythms are tied into this whole process. And remember, melatonin output declines drastically as we age. So, something to think about if you aren't already supporting it with supplementation. That's something you could do even beyond talking about Epitalon. Melatonin is a really wonderful thing to utilize as we get older, in my opinion. Epitalon also impacts oxidative stress and mitochondrial health. It increases expression of key antioxidant enzymes like our superoxide dismutase, catalase, and NQ01. This is all through NRF2 signaling. I think we need to do a deep dive into NRF2 because it's pretty pivotal to everything. But in human fibroblasts, this translated into lowered reactive oxygen species, ROS. That means improved mitochondrial membrane potential and protection from senescence-related damage. Remember, senescent cells are those zombie cells that secrete those inflammatory cytokines, kind of damage or wreak havoc on the nearby cells. So, senescence is definitely something that's being studied in the longevity space as well. Okay, and now onto the immune side. So Epitalon plays a role here. It appears to recalibrate the immune system, not overstimulate, which we never want that. We always want the immune system to work in coordination. It should go up when it needs to fight off something and then come back down to baseline after that. We never want to overstimulate or oversuppress the immune system. However, as we age, our immune system starts to slow down, and it actually has a word for this. It's called immunosenescence. So how does Epitalon fit in? Well, Epitalon increases IL-2 expression, and it improves the CD4 to CD8 ratio. And that's really important as we age because that starts to drift. And so it's actually kind of bringing it back to like a more youthful pattern. It also influences immune signaling centers in the hypothalamus. That's the kind of master regulator. And this is basically immune rejuvenation. So I hate the word immune boosting because, again, we don't really want to like overstimulate the immune system. But rejuvenating kind of implies that it's restoring it back to like a more youthful state. Not, again, I always say this, like, we're not trying to be 18, but we just want to have a better functioning at every age. So that's what it seems to be doing. It seems to be shifting it back to a more regulated, healthy state. Now, there's also data on neuroprotection. So in animal models, Epitalon reduced oxidative DNA damage in neurons, again, the brain cells, and it increased neuroprotective amyloid precursor protein fragments. Those are very important for Alzheimer's disease. You might have heard of them. It enhanced acetylcholine-related enzyme activity, and it primed human stem cells towards neuronal differentiation, which I mentioned earlier. So they took these mesenchymal stem cells and they added Epitalon, and they were able to see that markers like nestin, GAP43, beta-3 tubulin, and double cortin, these were all upregulated, indicating that it could be differentiating towards the neuronal state. This could be very interesting for neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's, dementia, Parkinson's, if the research evolves in that way, which I hope that it does. But again, what we have currently is still very early. It suggests that epitalon may support neuronal resilience, and it acts upstream by, this oxidative stress pathway through epigenetic pathways and through differentiation pathways. So it's kind of playing a role in multiple aspects, which is really cool. One study used a neuroblastoma cell line that is a brain cell line, and Epitalon actually increased the secretion of soluble amyloid precursor protein, and they did this by 20%. This is actually the neuroprotective form, not the pathogenic amyloid beta fragments that are implicated in Alzheimer's disease. It also increased acetylcholinesterase and butyrylcholinesterase activity, and these are key enzymes that help modulate acetylcholine, which is part of that neurotransmitter signaling and critical for learning and memory. So these point to epitalon as a potential candidate for age-related cognitive decline, even potentially Alzheimer's treatment. Of course, this is still early, so I'm not making those claims. I'm just saying the research is kind of pointing us in that direction. One of the most interesting studies came from human fibroblasts, and these were reprogrammed into neurons once treated with epitalon. And I'm going to post a picture here because it's pretty impressive. These morphological changes are essential for preserving learning capacity, memory, and neuronal resilience as we age or even after brain injury. So again, this could be really powerful after stroke, brain injury, that sort of thing, if the research, takes us there. Neurons, as we know, they're especially vulnerable, especially to oxidative stress, because they have a very high energy demand. The brain takes up a lot of energy. And so in this neuroblastoma cell line, epitalon reduced levels of a key marker of oxidative DNA damage, 8-hydroxydeoxyguanosine. And this is something that's actually elevated in Alzheimer's and Parkinson's disease. So that is, again, another really cool possible application of this peptide. And in a study of human gingival and periodontal stem cells, Epitalon enhanced expression of neuronal progenitors. So again, these were expression of genes nestin, GAP43, beta tubulin 3, and double cortin. And this study suggested that epitalon may prime certain stem cells towards the neuronal lineage, which again could be really interesting for regenerative neurology, brain injury recovery, post-stroke, treatment of, these neurodegenerative diseases. Very cool. Cognitive decline is not inevitable, but it is multifactorial. So what makes epitalon interesting is that it doesn't just tackle one element, like we've said throughout the video. It touches multiple areas of neuronal health specifically. So neurotransmitter regulation, synaptic plasticity, protection from oxidative DNA damage, and then stem cell priming towards this neurogenesis pathway. In other words, pushing stem cells towards forming new neurons. We don't have any human clinical data yet. These are all animal studies or cell line studies. So just to be very clear, it's a very interesting application of epitalon in longevity, especially cognitive research. But I just want to be clear, this isn't in human studies yet. Now, let's talk about the cancer aspect. And I want to be very clear about this as well. So it's not considered as a cancer treatment in any way, shape, or form. There are no clinical trials using it that way, but we do have some pretty interesting animal studies showing reduced tumor incidence, delayed tumor onset, and reduced chromosomal aberrations and stabilized chromatin structure. And these were in aging models. We have a HER2-neu breast cancer mouse. This is a very aggressive form of breast cancer, and there's a mouse model after it. And we also have a model of colon cancer where this epitalon was studied. Now, again, not overstating that there are no clinical trials with epitalon as a cancer therapy, but we do have these animal studies that suggest it might reduce mutation load, normalize gene expression, and potentially delay onset of tumors in the mouse model. Doesn't always translate to humans, I have to say, but it's really cool, interesting early research. And the number one cause of death in mice is cancer. They don't really have too many other like natural diseases. So it's kind of interesting to study cancer in mice because, there's no really confounding other pathways that, they're going to die unless you force them to have heart disease. but naturally, that's what they die from. So it's a really interesting model system. And what we can say is that genomic instability is, clearly it's one of the hallmarks of cancer. And in several of the preclinical models, Epitalon was demonstrated to reduce the chromosomal aberrations, meaning that those breaks and translocations, these are breaks in the DNA and translocations to the DNA that basically set the stage for developing cancer. And Epitalon seems to benefit that, reduce that, I should say. So that points toward a possible role in genomic maintenance and possibly cancer risk modulation in this aging system. Again, not a cancer therapy, context, dose, timing, individual risk, all matter. Nobody is unique. I mean, everybody is unique. Nobody, no two cancers are rarely identical or homogeneous. They are very different and they have lots of different mutations and things that are going on. So it's really hard to make a broad statement like that, but it looks pretty promising. So we also have the HER2 transgenic mouse model. This is again an aggressive form of cancer, and we have a mouse model that kind of replicates that as much as possible in a mouse system. And this system, they spontaneously develop mammary tumors, breast tumors. In this model, Epitalon reduced the overall incidence of breast cancer, and the tumors that developed later were smaller in size, and the total number of tumors that developed in each mouse was reduced by Epitalon. So that's pretty interesting. And again, this is a very aggressive breast cancer, HER2/neu. So it's HER2/neu is a clinical target in human breast cancer. It's like a known mutation pathway that a lot of breast cancers can go down that pathway, and that's how the breast cancer kind of initiates. So it would be interesting if Epitalon can play a role in kind of modulating that. I mean, it's definitely not considered as a treatment, but you don't know, you never know. It could be potentially like an adjuvant therapy. This remains to be studied, but similar to thymosin alpha, how it helps with the immune system during chemotherapy. Possibly this peptide could play a role, anything like that. But obviously, we need way more studies and we need human studies before we can make any claim. As for dosing, most of the human research protocols use between half to 1 milligram per day, so 0.5 to 1 milligram per day for 10 to 20 days. And then this is cycled 2 to 3 times per year. Typically, administration is subcutaneous injection or intranasal. That has been used in several studies, especially for cognitive function. If you've heard me talk about this before, I think if you're using the peptide for brain cognitive function, typically I think that the best route is intranasal. There's also sublingual use, but typically we don't find that in the market. So I do want to address this because there is some confusion on dosing because early studies used epithalamine, and this is actually a peptide mixture. It's not pure epithalin or Epitalon. So based on the literature, these lower dose protocols, the 0.5 to 1 milligrams per day, that appears more consistent with the observed effects. But if you see these higher dosing protocols, I've seen 10 milligrams per day, that's where that's coming from. People thought that you were needing to multiply by 10. That's not really substantiated in the literature. And in fact, one paper that I found, I'll try to find the link and put it here. That one specifically said, 1 milligram per day, and that would be my personal usage as well. So again, I mean, this is still experimental. We don't have large randomized clinical trials, long-term safety data. We don't have validated pharmacokinetics. Of course, that all matters, but for the typical research, I think the 1 milligram per day is kind of the most well studied. So Epitalon as a longevity peptide. What is my take? What is my final view on this? Well, I'm going to say that mechanistically, it does check a lot of the boxes. So it influences our telomeres, clearly. It influences epigenetics. It has an impact on circadian rhythm, melatonin. It impacts oxidative stress. It has an influence on immune aging, and it can impact our neuronal resilience or, possibly even benefit some neuronal type diseases. So that makes me say that it's not just hype. It's definitely got a lot of really cool systems biology there, and it's very compelling. Perhaps the most interesting idea emerging from this research is that aging isn't just about this accumulated damage, it's also about this loss of biological timing. And this is kind of the key aspect of that, right? Our circadian rhythm. And, it's kind of, one of those things we all suffer as we get older of like you're sleeping so well when you're a teenager, and then the older you get, it's just harder and harder to sleep. So I think we've all, if you're over 40, probably experienced that and know exactly what I'm talking about. So I find it fascinating that telomerase is linked to circadian rhythms. And let me know if you find that interesting too. I thought that was one of the most interesting aspects when I was diving into this research. So let me know in the comments what your thoughts are. And so Epitalon, through its effects on the pineal gland, through circadian rhythm, gene regulation, it sits right at this intersection of aging and longevity. And whether that translates into meaningful human health span extension is still an open question, let's be fair. But from a research perspective, and I am, that's kind of what I do, that's my background. From a research perspective, it is one of the most elegant peptides that we have, and it's very interesting. I see that there's a lot of recent publications, so that gets me excited. A lot of the bioregulators were typically studied in like the 70s, 80s, 90s, and then we don't have a lot, recent. So I love that this one seems to still be, people are publishing and doing work on it. So that's a good thing. And I'm excited to see where this goes. If this video helped you think differently about aging, that was the goal. And I share this work because I believe people deserve better context around their health, especially as we age. So if you're looking for more individualized support, I do want to mention I offer one-on-one coaching where we can look at your lifestyle, training, health history, even labs if you have that, and we can kind of come up with a longevity protocol that makes sense for you, customized to you. This is all linked below in the description. I also run a private women's peptide and longevity club, and this is where I teach even more, answer questions, we go deeper into the science, and we have like a weekly live call where you can ask me anything, and that's also linked below. And if you want to grab my free peptide guide and cheat sheet, that's linked below in the description, and it's a very simple educational resource that you can reference along with this video. And everything, the coaching, the private community, the free resources are all linked below. And as always, thank you for being here and for thinking critically about your health, and I'll see you in the next video.